Hey everyone, we are going to be doing the walkthrough today for React Router Movies, which I'm excited about because it shows off the power of finally being able to write applications with multiple pages within React. So let's take a look. The first thing I want to discuss is the project setup here. You can see I have two terminals open. One is in the root directory of the project, and the other one is within client. So there was a lot of confusion with this, and it's fine. The directions have been updated, and I think they're much clearer now. But it kind of injures me physically to see people, asking questions that are answered directly in the README in the project instructions. Because it's like, I just imagine myself like trying to give a recommendation for you for the job, and it's like, oh, they write great code. Awesome. Awesome code. Great developer. They don't really read the instructions, though. Like, that's not a good look. So, the way this project is structured is for the first time, we have both the API server application as well as the React client application. So we have to get both of those up and running in order for our project to function. You'll see in this root directory, where I am in this bottom terminal, we see these files. I've already run yarn install here, which is why we see node modules, but we also have our own package.json file. That's because at the root of this project there is another JavaScript project, and it houses the server that is going to provide the data when we make our Axios requests. So here I have to run yarn start, and that's going to find the command associated with that in this package.json. And I get this, server listening on port 5000. Something I again saw confusion with is people would then visit localhost 5000 in their browser, the same way that you would when the React application starts on localhost 3000. But we get this, and it seems like an error message, and it technically is, but it's not relevant. This is just an API server. Different routes on the server are going to return different data. There's nothing, it's slash. That's why it's saying we can't get any data here, because the server doesn't have any. If we go to API movies, we will actually see the JSON that this server returns here. But we don't have to open this in the browser. We're just going to be using this to make the Axios requests inside of our React application. So we have to make sure it's running in our terminal, and then we can basically ignore it. Now, in the client directory, that's where our React app lives. That's where we see another package.json, the source, public files. I already have my node modules because I ran yarn install here. So let me start up this project, and then it is going to open my browser, and if I go to localhost 3000, I am going to see my React project. And there we are. We're ready to start. We have both of these servers set up, one for our React app and one for the API. So let's dive on in. In source, I'm going to take a look at index.js. This is where our React application gets kicked off, and this is where we need to hook up our application to the router. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'll do it down here. I'm going to import browser router as router using this renaming convention with named imports from React router DOM. And then I need to wrap my app component in the router component. So now that I've done this, we see nothing has happened. But what this has done is it's set up behind the scenes the ability for the routes to provide all the necessary information to these things and have our routes actually work. So this is set up. I'm going to show the error message you get when you remove this because I want you all to see it and go like, ah, because you're going to forget at some point. So now we're going to take a look inside of app.js. Here's where the stuff in our application lives, just like any other React app. We have this saved list component, which we're not really going to do much with now, but I need to put my routes in here. So I am going to, I'll do it up here this time. Oop. I'm going to import route from React Router DOM. And this is where I'm going to start writing my routes. So I want one on the root, right? I want something to show up when we're just at localhost 3000. We're just at our application. So I'm going to set up a path at root, and then I need to figure out the component I want to render. Luckily, if we check this movies directory, we see that they've been gracious enough to provide us with components. And the one we want here is the movie list. Let me add some semicolons. So this movie list component is going to render all of the movies from our API. You can see here inside this Axios GET request, this is where we're making a request to localhost 5000 and getting that data. That's why we have to have the server running on port 5000. So I can import this component from a relative path, / is where I currently am, into movies, and then into movie list. And I can give this to my route. Now all my movies show up. Simple as that. But I've made a mistake here, which is that if I were to visit another location on my server, the movie list still shows up. That's because the path I gave to route is just this root level /. And by default, route only matches the partial part of the path. It's going to start matching from the beginning. And it's going to see this root level / and be like, yep, it matches. So if we do just path equals /, we will always display this component, which sometimes we want to do because that's going to give us access to those routing props that we don't get just in a normal component if it's not set up under the route. But here I don't want this movie list to always be displayed. So I have to add a new prop to my route, which is exact. And I can give this a value like true to say I want it to match the exact path. And if I save this file, we'll see that it now disappears because I'm under test. But if we just specify the name of a prop and don't give it any value, what it's going to do is assume that the value we want to give that prop is true. So more commonly, you're going to be seeing this written as exact, and that's it. And that does the exact same thing. So now we have our movie list rendering at the root of our application and nowhere else, which is exactly what we want. Let's take a look at our instructions and see what they want us to do next. So now we have our movie list on the route, and we also want to set up a route for the individual movies. The way we do this is we're going to make another route, we're going to give it a path, and I want it to be at /movies /an ID. And I'm going to specify that with a colon in front of it. Because what that colon does is it tells React Router that I want you to parse out that portion of the URL and then give it to me as a value inside of the params object inside of map. Or not map, inside of match. And we're going to see how that works in just a minute. The component that I want to render here is going to be the movie component. So I'm going to import movie from movies. movie.js. And that's the component I'm going to give to this route. So now I have my two routes set up. One for the movie list, and then one for those individual movies. So, let's see what happens. If I visit /movie, let's do /1. Alright. I get nothing, and that's because I mistyped the route. /movies /1. I get an error here. And I might categorize this as a bug in the component we already got, but I'm very glad this bug is here, because this is something we're going to see all the time when we write components that fetch data from an API. So we're going to read this error message. It tells us so kindly, stars is undefined. And it's telling us this is happening in the movie.js file. So let's go there. Let's go into movie.js and let's look for our stars variable. Well, right here I'm trying to map over it. And that's a problem if stars is undefined, because undefined doesn't have a member function called map. Doesn't have a property called map. That might be other errors you see when you get these undefined popping up. So we're seeing that stars is undefined. Well, where do we define stars? Here on line 33, we're using destructuring to get the value of stars out of the movie object. Well, where do we define the movie object? At the top of our file. The movie object is where we're setting the value from the API. And we see when we're done with the API request, we're going to set that value of movie to be whatever object we get back from the API. And that should have a value for stars, and we should be able to map over it. But that isn't the issue. Our Axios request takes time. So this isn't going to fire. This set movie isn't going to fire until the server gives us back our data, which is going to take some time. So in the initial render of movie, the initial value, the default value of movie, is going to be whatever value we give useState, which is going to be an empty map, or I'm sorry, an empty object. And so movie.stars is equal to that stars variable we're creating down there. And during the first render, movie.stars is going to be undefined. That's why we're getting that error, because it doesn't have a value in the initial movie. And we can see this. We can console log movie here. And if we check our developer tools and check our console, we see that movie is in fact an empty object. So stars is going to be undefined. The error is not lying to us. There's a couple ways of handling this. You can see that cleverly we've set up on line 29 this if statement. It's using this not operator, which inverts the truthiness of whatever comes after it. So not true is literally equal to false, and not false is literally equal to true. So what this is checking is it's checking if movie is defined, because not null is the same as not undefined, which is the same as not false, which is the same as true. So we're checking to see if movie has some value. But because we set the initial value of movie to be this empty object, this if statement is, we're never going to run what's inside of it. We're never going to do that. I can go over to my REPL here and we can see what I mean. So if I do not null, I get true. If I do not undefined, I get true. But if I do not empty object, I get false, because that's a truthy value. What we mean by that is, it's defined. It has some value. It's not null or undefined or false. So this if statement is never actually going to run. We can fix this in a couple ways. One, I could check maybe if some value in movie is defined. If I check and see if the title is defined, then we'll no longer get that error, because for an empty object, title isn't going to be defined. But what if we have a movie that doesn't have a title? I don't know what indie filmmakers are up to these days, so I don't necessarily want to trust that. So another option is we can change the default value that we're giving this movie here to be null. Now, during the first run, this is going to be executing not null, which is going to give us true, which means this if branch is going to run, and we're going to return a div that says loading. And that's going to shortcut the execution of the rest of our function. If we return, our function stops running. It just returns that value. So we never get down here into our big return, where we're trying to do stars.map. There is a third solution, which is we can leave the default value as an empty object, and we cannot do this movie thing. Then what I can do is down here, I can check and see if stars is defined before I run the map on it. And I can do that with the AND operator. This essentially reads, if stars is true, then do what's on the right-hand side. It's basically the ternary with only the true branch. And if I do this, I never get a loading div. This is all going to pop up with undefined values, but we're never actually going to execute this map. These are the three ways that we can handle this. They're all having different trade-offs, but it's important to recognize that this is just JavaScript we're dealing with. This isn't really a quirk of React. We just have undefined values that, we can't use in the way that we can use defined values. So we have to figure out how we want to handle that. So I'm going to stick with what I believe the intent was, which is to use this if statement to return early, to shortcut our function, and I'm going to set the default value of movie to be null. So that way we get our little loading div, and then we get our card that pops up whenever our API returns. So.
Hey, Henry?
Yes.
So in the help channel yesterday, so I was having that issue in the help channel yesterday, someone said to remove everything from the parentheses. So instead of null, it was empty.
Yes.
What's the difference between putting null in and having it empty?
When we don't give a function an argument, in the body of that function, that argument is treated as undefined. So leaving this empty is the same as me explicitly giving undefined to it. I just prefer visually to give it a value of null, because that way it looks intentional. Right? If I leave it empty, I'm not necessarily explicitly defining the behavior I'm using. And just seeing this line, I might be led to believe that we never care about the default value, whereas stylistically, if I see this null or undefined here, then I know that whoever wrote this code did that on purpose. And this might lead me to believe that this initial value is important. It doesn't really matter. This is just my stylistic choice to make this null. But leaving it empty is functionally going to be essentially identical.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Does anyone have any questions with what I did here? Because this is a departure from routes. This is just an important bit of JavaScript and React fundamentals here.
I actually have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be possible to use the Lodash is empty, because Lodash comes with create React app, or?
You could. I know Lodash is installed as a dependency of React and React scripts, but are we allowed to like import Lodash from Lodash? Is that going to give me any errors? Okay, yeah. So we can use a library called Lodash, which gives us a bunch of functionality that we would tend to expect by default in JavaScript. Like, how do you tell if an object is empty? In default JavaScript, we kind of have to implement workarounds because we can't just check if some object is equal to an empty object, because JavaScript isn't going to check the equality of the contents of these objects. It's going to check and see if these are the same object in the memory of our computer, which it's not. So Lodash gives us some nice helper functions, like the ability to check if an object is empty. It's installed as a dependency because of other things we've installed. If you do use it in your project, I would recommend explicitly adding it as a dependency. I don't really want to use Lodash if it's not listed as a dependency in my project.json, even though this works. So if you did that, then feel free to use Lodash, but add it as an explicit dependency.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions with this? All right. Well, then I'm going to move on. Let's check the README, which is very important that we read and see what it wants us to do next. So part 1, we've created these routes. Now in part 2, I want to make it so the movies in movie list links to the individual data for that movie. So I'm going to navigate back to home, and we're going to add links to these. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to check out the movie list component. In here, I am getting data from my API, and then I'm mapping over it to create a bunch of these movie details components. And in here, I'm, styling them and adding the data that I want, and it's all working great. But I want to add a link to this. So what we do is we import link from our React router DOM, because we don't use A tags directly in React when we're linking to parts of our own application. We want to just change the URL of our browser. We don't want to trigger a reload of a new page. And I can literally just wrap this entire component in a link component. Then I have to set the to prop on this, and I want to set it to movies and then the ID of my current movie, which I want to be specific to the current movie that I'm rendering. So I can't just use a static string here. We might be tempted to write :ID here because that's what we wrote in our route, but let's see what happens. So now these are links, and if I click on it, we see that the URL I go to is literally movies :ID, which is not what I want. I want it to be movies 0, 1, 2, 3. I want it to be the ID associated with my current movie. So I have to make this string dynamic. I want it to change based on my current movie. We know how to make dynamic strings. We can do it with a template string. So instead of using double quotes, I can use backticks. And I can do movies /$ curly braces, and then whatever value I want to use here, which is going to be movie.id. I want to grab that ID value out of the movie that we're receiving as props. But, let me correct my spelling error, we're getting some syntax errors here, because these backticks, this template string, is JavaScript. So when we write JavaScript inside of our JSX, it needs to be wrapped in curly braces. So we get this seemingly excessive nesting of curly braces that mean different things, but it's important to recognize that template strings or backticks are JavaScript code. So we have to use curly braces when we write it inside of our JSX. Now, for each one of these components, the link is going to go to movies 0, movies 1, movies 2, and so these work. These correctly point to movies with whatever ID that we're getting for that movie. Does anyone have any questions with what I did here?
I will say a lot of people struggled because of that exact thing on that project.
Mm-hmm.
It was definitely a big thing, like, because that'll mess up your whole flow of everything.
Yeah.
If you just aren't passing that ID in, right?
Yeah. And so I want to show you some of the common mistakes that I saw. because the important thing when we're developers is not to avoid mistakes, but to know how to recover from them. So let's say I left out this $sign because I'm suddenly used to my JSX syntax of where I need to write JavaScript. I just do curly braces, and I might forget that I need a $sign inside of my template strings. So what happens now is this link, if I look, I can see the curly braces in there. And on your browser, I think in Chrome it doesn't render the curly brace. You get like a percent, I don't know what it is, like LD or something like that, L5 maybe. And that's because inside of URLs, we often aren't allowed to write these special characters. Instead, there are escape sequences. So let me Google, escape, URL escape curly brace. So the URL encoding of a curly brace is going to be %7b, at least for the opening one. So if you see percent and then random characters showing up in here, that usually means that you goofed up and you accidentally included a special character in your URL where you probably meant to include some dynamic data. So that's something we might see. Additionally, we might have done intuitively something like this. We might have just done $ID. Now we're getting an error. It's telling us ID is not defined. This error message is not lying to us. Right? The error messages tell us the truth, even though we might not always want to hear it. And that's because I don't define an ID anywhere inside of this component. Inside of movie details, there's no ID variable. There is an ID field in the movie object, which is why movie.id worked. But here, where I'm destructuring all these values, I don't get the ID. If I wanted to, I could do comma ID, and suddenly now I've declared a variable called ID that's going to have the value of the ID from my movie. This works. But when we get those errors telling us things are undefined, it's not wrong. We probably have not defined something. So those are the common mistakes that I was seeing and how we recover from them. Google is your best friend. Before you turn to the help channel, try just Googling the error message you're getting or Googling the weird stuff that's showing up. Investigate it, because those are the really valuable skills we want to build. The problem solving, the using your available resources. Obviously, come to the help channel if you can't figure it out, but I really want to see people practicing those problem solving skills. Okay, so now we've run into another issue, which is that no matter which movie I click on, I get Star Wars, which is great because Star Wars is a good film, but that's not the functionality I want in my application. The reason for this is because of my movie component. We can see in my Axios GET request, I am always getting the ID. But my ID is always set to 1. This isn't a dynamic value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log props. And I'm going to put a string in front of it that says movie so I know what component this is in. It never hurts to do this. If you're struggling with understanding how prompts are getting passed and what they are inside of each component, just put this at the top of every component so you can check and see what prompts are. You don't have to guess. You can look, you can inspect it, you can use the prompts you want, and then you can get rid of the console log later. So I see I'm getting this object, and the props are going to be history, location, and match. That's because we're rendering this component with a route, and route provides some props to us. It gives us history, location, and match. And what we're interested in is if we go into our app.js, the path we specified way back when at the start of this video was movies and :ID. And this colon tells React Router that I want you to parse out that segment of the URL for me. And so our URL is formatted /movies and then a value for ID. If we look inside of this match object, inside of props, we'll see that there's another object with the key of params, and inside of there, that's where we're getting the value for our ID. So what I want is props.match.params.id. And now we see in here that I am getting 0. That's the ID of my current movie. And if I flip over to Lord of the Rings, now I'm getting an ID of 2, which is what's showing up in my URL. That's how we access these URL parameters, these URL params from our paths that we've set up with React Router. Now I want to use this instead of the hard-coded one. So I can write props.match.params.id, and now I'm going to go and get the appropriate value for my API. I'm not always going to get Star Wars. Let's see if it works if I do this. Okay, no, it's going to reload the page. So there's a subtle thing that we've done here that isn't entirely correct, which is this second argument to useEffect. This is called the dependency array. That's just a fancy way of saying that the callback in our useEffect depends on certain values. It's kind of like an informal argument list. And the reason we specify it is because useEffect is going to look inside of this array and see if any of these values have changed between the previous render, and if it has, then it's going to rerun the callback. It's going to rerun our API request. Some of you might be confused because it's working. If I go here and I click on Godfather, I get Godfather. Then if I click on Star Wars, I get Star Wars. It appears to be working just fine. And that's because our dependency array is currently an empty array. And we learned a couple projects ago that when we give it this empty array, that means it's going to run the first time we render this component. And every time we navigate back to the root and we're rendering the movie list component, we're no longer rendering our movie component. And so we've unmounted it. We've essentially deleted it from the current display of our application. Now when I click here and we render it again, we're rendering it again for the first time. So our useEffect runs. But if I were to, let's say, add a link inside of here, which I'm going to do really quickly, import link from React Router DOM, and then I'm just going to add a dummy link inside of here. And I'm going to set this equal to /movies/2. Oop, this should be a string. Other movie. So now look what happens when I click this link. Nothing appears to have happened. We've noticed the URL has changed. We're now at movies 2, whereas we're previously at movies 0. And if I flip between them, nothing seems to happen. But what's showing up in our console is another set of console logs. And that's because we're re-rendering our component. But we're not rendering it again for the first time, so the useEffect doesn't run. So what we want to do is we want to make sure to add that ID to the dependency array of the useEffect. That way, useEffect will see that the ID has changed and know that it needs to rerun that callback. It needs to get the new data from our API. If that's tough to remember, our general rule of thumb for useEffects are, if we're using a variable inside of here, put it in the dependency array. Because chances are, if the value of this variable changes, I want to rerun my callback, right? If it depends on this data and I have new data, then I probably want to do it again. There's a little subtle problem here that I saw a lot where intuitively, correctly, we want to just put ID in there because we declared it as a variable, but we can't because of scoping issues. Because we declared this variable of ID inside this callback function, so I can't use it in the scope outside of that callback function. There are two solutions. One, we can just get it out of the params again. This will work just fine. So now, when I'm on The Godfather, and when I click into the other movie, UseEffect is going to see that this value is changed from 0 to 2. And it's going to rerun the Axios request. It's going to rerun this callback. But this is a little bit verbose. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to define my ID up here. And now I can use that variable inside of my dependency array. And this is essentially the same thing. If I go to 0, I have The Godfather. And if I click here, now re-renders with Lord of the Rings because that parameter has indeed changed. So, does anyone have any questions with this? No? We're feeling good about UseEffect? I want everyone to have a positive relationship with UseEffect, because this is super powerful behavior. This is so nice that I can just say, yeah, I want the new data whenever I get a new IT. That's all we're telling UseEffect. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant that it works the way that it does. And I want us to feel comfortable doing this. So make sure you understand what's going on here. Alright, so now we have that hooked up. And let's check our instructions. Let's see. In part 2, we will need to get the correct ID. We also want to add the functionality so the home button on saved list navigates back to home. We click on it right now, nothing happens. Let's do that real fast. So let's go into movies and saved list. And we can see that the home button is just a div. So I'm going to make it a link. I'll just import link from React Router DOM. And then I'm going to change my div into a link. And I'm going to give it a toProp that's going to point to home, which is just that root level slash. Oop. I want to save this file. So now when I click on home, it does indeed navigate me back to home. Easy as that. Let's check out what else we're supposed to do. Great. So that's it for the MVP of this project. Does anyone have any questions about this? All right. Well, if we're feeling... Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey, Henry.
Mm-hmm.
The part about render the route, was that stretch?
Yes, that is stretch, and
Oh,
we have some time now, and I'd like to go over that.
I did that, but I didn't put that in my retro
Oh.
because I didn't know it was stretch. I thought it was MVP.
Ah, we gotta read the README.
Yeah.
Read the README. You want a good recommendation from me. We all know that's the most important, the important part of graduating Lambda.
Yeah, I guess I stopped reading after MVP, but
Yeah.
then I was like continuing coding.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So here are our stretch goals. One is refactoring our code, but I'm going to do this save movie functionality first, because this shows off some of the advanced features of writing routes and how we pass more prompts to things. So we have inside of app.js this functionality already set up for us to have a list of saved movies, and then a function that will add movies to that list. And you can see they're using that spread operator we got a little practice with today in lecture. And we're going to render that list inside of our save list component, that little nav thing at the top. But what I want to do is I want to add the ability so that when we click on this save button, we're actually going to save this movie to that list. So we get it populated. To do that, we need to somehow get this function, add to save list, into our movie component. But it doesn't appear immediately obvious because I can't pass it as props. right? I'm just giving it this component. There's no way for me to give this props. What we do in this case is instead of using component, we use a different, why am I blanking on the word? We use a different prop than component. We're going to use a prop called render. And this allows us to give the route a function that will create the component that we want to render. So what we do is we write a function that takes in props, and this is going to contain all of the props that route wants to give to our component. The location, history, match. This is a very important step. We want to make sure we want to grab those props. And then I'm going to render my movie component. I'm going to give it all of those props, which we could do individually by doing, history is equal to props.history. Location is going to equal props.location. And match is equal to match.location. I'm sorry, props.match. Oof. But this should set off our developer senses. First, let's check and see if it works. Yay, it works. And I can click around and it works just fine. We've essentially done the same thing that this component prop already does. But this is where our developer sensor should be tingling. I've just had to repeat myself a lot. And I'm lazy, I don't want to do that. So what we can do is we can use our spread operator. And instead of doing all these manually, I can write ... props. What this does is the spread operator strips off the outer layer of brackets from our data structure. So if props is an object, which it is, we're going to remove those outer curly braces. And when we do that, what are we left with? Just the contents of the object. And those are going to be key value pairs. History colon something. Location colon something. Match colon something. What are those good for? Well, that happens to essentially be what props are. Right? What I've written here is just key value pairs. History is a key, the right-hand side is a value. Location is a key, the right-hand side is a value. So if we use the spread operator on an object, we just add the contents of it as props to our component. And we can see I can comment this right out, and it works. We're still getting the history, location, and match props inside of our movie component. If that's confusing, let's see what happens if I just declare a temporary object right here. It has a value of a of 1 and b of 2. If I use spread on this object, ... obj, we'll see that now movie is, wait, why didn't it do that? Let's refresh this page. Oh, I love it when I make mistakes during these. I wonder if it's because of these comments. Why is it not doing this for me?
You see the little 2 after the object? That might be a hint.
Well, it should still be doing that for me. I should still be getting A and B in here. Uh-oh. This is the longest I think I've been stuck on one of these. What am I?
Wouldn't you have to set the prop equal to the object and spread it in the object?
No, you should be able to add multiple props like this. I don't think it's actually. Oh my goodness. Oh, oh gosh. I did this before and somehow I forgot. So we've already sent this component prop. And so even though we're adding this render prop, it doesn't do anything because the route checks to see if you've set the component prop first. And I thought to myself, I'm doing this on purpose because then I'm gonna remove this and we're gonna kick over into the render prop. And now, now we see we have our additional props. We're still getting all the props that our route is trying to give us, history, location, match, and we're also getting the props from the object. We have A and B equal to 1, and now we have test equal to something, because we can add additional props as we please from more objects, or just the way we're familiar with writing props, and it still works. But now what I want to do is I want to also give this my add to save list function. So I'm going to create a prop called add to save list, and I'm going to set its value equal to that function. Now we see inside of the prompts object that movie is getting, we are indeed getting that add to save list function. So let's switch over to our movie file. And let's take a look at that save button that we have. Where is our save button? It's right here. So we have this save button, and when I click on it, I want it to run add to save list. But add to save list expects a movie to be added to this list. And let's see exactly what it wants. Let me jump over to the saved list. So what it's doing is it's mapping over the objects that it's getting here inside of this list prop, and it's pulling out the title of that movie. So it's going to expect an entire movie object. So I can't do something like onClick is equal to props dot add to saved list. Because does anyone know what argument is going to be given when we click on this div?
Will it be the function add to save list?
Well, this is the callback function that we're giving to onClick. But when I actually click on this button, it's going to run this function.
It's not receiving the event.
That's exactly what it is going to receive. If I console log inside of add to save list, the argument that it does receive by default is going to be an event. That's what it's getting. Because just like a normal JavaScript, when we write an event listener and we call it, the DOM is going to try to give the event that triggered to that callback function. But that's not what add to save list actually wants. So what we do here is we wrap this in a callback function, and then we call this with the movie. So that when we click on this div, we don't actually care about the event. We're just calling the add to save list function with the movie object that it wants, not the event. So now when I click here, we suddenly see this show up. Because
so if you wanted to pass the movie, pass the event using the callback syntax, how would you do that?
So event is just given as an argument to our callback function. I didn't choose to use it, so I didn't need to reference it, but I can just have my callback take an argument here. I can just have it take the event and do whatever we want with it. If this were a button, with submit, we saw with forms today that can occasionally cause some unexpected behavior. So maybe I want to call event.preventDefault. And I'm absolutely allowed to do this. But the important thing is when I click this button, that we're giving the add to save list function the movie object that it expects. And if I go here and I go to Godfather, I can click save, and I get the Godfather added to it. And any questions with this?
One question.
Mhm.
So on the event properties there, like on click, for example,
Mhm.
so when you don't define a callback and you just pass in like your callback that was defined somewhere else, does it automatically push the event in
Yeah.
to the argument list?
Because the way it works is if we give onClick a function, which is what it wants, it calls that function whenever the event is fired, and it passes the event to it as the first argument. That's just how the event works. That's how all of these events work. Just like in our add event listener, in normal JavaScript, we add our event listener to an element, and we'd write a callback function that accepted an event, or didn't, because we didn't need to use it. But with JavaScript, we can always provide extra arguments to functions, even if they don't require it. So I can remove this and comment this out, and nothing bad happens. I'm just never bothering to save that argument into a variable. So if I were to give it this add to save list function directly, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It runs my callback, and it gives it the event as an argument. But that's not what my add to save list function is set up to do. It doesn't want an event as an argument, it wants a movie object. So I have to manually specify that I need to give this function the movie object, because the event listener isn't going to know how to do that.
Right, yeah, I was just curious because I thought in order to pass any arguments into your callback, you had to invoke it and like manually pass them through. I didn't know it would automatically do that.
Yeah, because when we write these anonymous arrow functions, these kind of one-time use functions where I take an event, there is nothing stopping me, literally nothing, from instead of defining this inline here, I can go up, I can write this function, I can say const save is equal to this function, and then I can give that as a value to my onClick. Because all it expects is a function.
Nice.
Doesn't care where I define it. We just use our arrow functions inline, because often we only need to write one line of code, so we might as well do it right there. But there's nothing preventing me from writing it like this.
Yeah, that's a really neat perk. I've never really used callbacks that I've defined somewhere else, so I didn't know it would automatically pass it in like that. That's cool.
Yeah. I think there's some confusion around the term callback. It's a callback isn't a special function. It's just a way we use a function. A callback is something we give to something else for it to run whenever it chooses. And so save is our callback function, but it's defined like a normal function. And oftentimes we'll define a callback in line because we only use it once in this special situation, so I don't need a reusable named function. But I'm absolutely allowed to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how we do that. And I'm gonna switch it back because I like the inline style for this in terms of having this set up when I push this code to GitHub. So I'm gonna do that. How do I want to format this? I'll do it like that. There we go. Yep, so that is our onClicks. This is how we pass arguments to components we're rendering with route, is with this render prop that we give a callback to, that we give a function to, which is going to render our component, and we can pass the props that route wants to give to it using our spread operator, as well as adding any other props that we want to.
So, Henry, regarding the passing multiple objects as a prop, I guess a prop to the component, what is the second object recognized as? Like, how does a component use it? I mean, is it like another addition to the props?
Yeah, it's just more props, because what we're doing, this props object that we're referencing here, it looks something like this. It's an object, it has history set equal to some value. It has match set equal to some value, and it has location set equal to some value. So when we use the spread operator on this object, what this does is it essentially deletes these curly braces. So what we end up with inside of this props list when it gets evaluated is these key value pairs. History and its value, match and its value, location and its value. And this is how props are passed under the hood, is they're these key value pairs. Just like add to save list equals something. This is just looking slightly differently, but that's exactly how they're treated by React. So React isn't really ever aware that props is an object, because we're removing those curly braces from it, and we're just giving this component these key value pairs. And those get interpreted as props, because that's all a prop is a key and value pair.
So what if you just wanted to pass in the history as a prop?
I'm absolutely allowed to do that. I can just say history is equal to props.history. I can still do it the normal way, and I can absolutely do all of these manually. Match. And this is the exact same thing of this spread syntax, but this is a little bit cleaner. I have to do less typing, which is nice for my wrists. And if we had more props in here magically, those would automatically get added too. Sometimes we're going to be passing down objects that contain, like, 10, 15 things in them, and I wouldn't want to type those all out manually. And if the names of any of them changed, like, I don't want to try to fix it. So we can use the spread operator to manually expand an object into props.
So is the component like destructure or like reading the object that's passed on it and then saying like, okay, this is the key, this is the prop name, and then the value? That's what the component is doing?
It's not reading the object, because what the spread operator does is it removes those curly braces from around that object. We're removing the object enclosing the key value pairs inside of it. So it's the same way. Let me pop open a REPL real fast and show how we use the spread operator with normal functions. So
maybe another analogy would be taking the contents out of the box.
yes, exactly. We're taking them out of the box. So I'm going to declare an array, and it has the values 1 and 2 in it. And I'm going to make a function called add that takes two values, and it returns the sum of those values. So if I call add, and I give it 1 and 2, I get 3. If I give it, 3 and 2, I get 5. But what I can't do is I can't give this an array 1 and 2. It doesn't work right. I can't do add and give it the array with 1 and 2 in there. But I want to give those values to this function. And we're so close, because we write arguments as this comma separated thing, 1, 2. And that's exactly what's inside of my array. All I need to do is figure out some way to remove those brackets from around it. So that's what our spread operator is for. So if I do add ... r, it's inserting those comma separated values here instead of the array with brackets in it. And now I get 3. And this is exactly analogous to what we're doing with the props. We're removing the curly braces and just giving those key value pairs as props. The same way we're removing these square brackets and giving the elements inside it as arguments.
But okay, in this case, you're actually passing in the spread operator without the brackets.
Well, that's because in app.js, we are writing JSX, and the spread operator is JavaScript code. So these curly braces aren't object curly braces.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
These
yeah,
are JSX curly braces.
Right,
right. Okay. I see now. Yeah. These are JSX, we need to run JavaScript now curly braces. If I added another set of curly braces in here, then we'd be creating an object using our spread, which is going to copy it, and we can see I'm getting a syntax error because that's meaningless. Yeah. So we're removing the objectness from this object and giving its key value pairs as props. So, any final questions on this?
I had a question about the other stretch goal with the refactoring.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't figure it out. I wasn't really sure what the instructions were asking.
Okay, we can do that really fast. All this is asking us to do is inside of movie list. We notice that the contents of movie details and the contents of the JSX inside of movie are essentially exactly the same. So we don't want to repeat ourselves as developer. That's what that acronym DRY means. Don't repeat yourself. So we want to centralize all this code into one component. So I'm going to create a file called moviecard.js. Oh, they already have it set up for us. That's nice. So here's where I want to centralize this code. So I'm just going to come in here, and I'm going to just cut all of this into my movie card. So we see my editors being nice to me. It's telling me that link isn't defined, so I need to import link from... Actually, I'm just going to remove this line because that was just there for instructive purposes. But it's also telling me that movie isn't defined, and that's because it isn't. Movie is something we defined inside of this movie component. So if I want to use my movie card in here, I can import it from the appropriate JavaScript file, moviecard.js, and then I can use it right here. I can return my rendered movie card function. But what data does this need in order to work? It needs my movie object. So I'm going to give it the movie object as a prop. Now inside of here, instead of destructuring this movie object that doesn't exist, I'm going to grab it out of my props. Oh. It's because I'm still trying to use this movie variable. So instead, something I could do is remake this variable movie and set it equal to props.movie. Or I could do this with destructuring, because that makes us look cooler. And now this works. So I've just moved the functionality out of movie and into its own component, movie card. I have to give movie card the data it needs as props, because that's how we pass data in React. And now that this is in its own component, I can use this inside of movie list as well. So in here, I can import movie card from /movie card. And instead of writing all of this JSX myself, I can make a movie card component, and I can give it a movie as props. And I'm still going to leave this movie details thing here because I'm adding this link around my movie card, and I still want that to work. So now if I go home, we get our movie list. Now rendering using this same reusable component. In here, I still have this save button because that's part of this movie card that I added. We could figure out ways to do conditional rendering on that, or we can leave it. It actually, oh, it breaks because add to saved list is not a function. So what we can do is we can, in movie card, check to see if add to save list is defined before we try to render that button. So I can check if add to save list is defined. If and only if it is defined, that's what my and means. It's the positive half of a ternary operator. Oop. If add to save list is defined, then I want to render my save button. So now it doesn't show up in movie list, but when we flip over here, it should have rendered. Did I make a typo? Oh, it's not working because of the fact that we're giving movie that add to save list prop. So movie has props.add to save list defined, but we're not in turn passing that down to movie card. This is going to be something we see very frequently in React, where we have to pass props down layer by layer until they get where they need to go. So I'm now going to give this movie card a prop called add to save list, and I'm going to give it my props.add to save list. If I wanted to, just to make sure that this component has access to history and location and match and add to save list, what I could do is just give it all of my props using this spread operator. And this is another pattern we see to make sure props gets passed down. There we go. Now we have a save button that works, and it doesn't show up inside of our movie list. Alright, any questions with this? Alright, last call. Okay, well thank you all so much for coming. This was a cool project, and good luck on your projects this afternoon. So,
Thanks a lot, Henry.
I'll see you later.
Thank you so much.